Hello everybody, this is Thrash Till Death here. I'm here today to talk to you about my top 5 albums of 2010 in response to the list by Jumble Junkie Music. I respect every one of the albums he's picked, and I'm just here today to talk to you about my 5 picks, just in response. I know this is coming a bit late, coming towards the end of January, but I've just been spending the last month just sort of mopping up the last few albums that I missed during the body of 2010. And I have found a couple more that are really good that I missed the first time round, so all's well that end well, I suppose. So, without further ado, my number 5 is The Never Ending Way of the Ore Warrior by Orphaned Land. These guys are a sort of Israeli post-progressive metal, come melodic death metal, come folk metal sort of band. And if I had to characterise The Never Ending Way of the Ore Warrior by way of comparison, it would probably be to call it like the Middle Eastern folk metal equivalent of Dream Theater's Scenes from a Memory. It's this absolutely massive 78 minutes epic concept album where every track bleeds into the next, and every minute of the album is just jam-packed full of these complex song compositions and elaborate exotic Middle Eastern melodies employing all sorts of local instruments, and it blends together all sorts of different cultural influences into this really sort of exotic sounding massive smorgasbord of progressive metal, and it's never boring once for the whole of its runtime, and it's just absolutely full of interesting songs wall to wall. So if you're into sort of progressive or folk metal at all, you owe it to yourself to check that one out. Number 4, which I don't actually have to hand because I got a loan of my copy from a friend, thank you by the way Max, is Anthropocentric by The Ocean. The Ocean are a German sort of post-rock, post-hardcore sort of band, and they released 2 albums this year, the first being Heliocentric, Anthropocentric being its conceptual counterpart, and it employs a lot of sort of classical influenced melodies, sort of lots of cellos and keys being used in sort of very meditative ambient sort of passages, taking a lot of cues from post-rock. But at the same time, it never sort of allows itself to wallow into self-indulgence or just sort of experimental weirdness for weirdness' sake. It employs a lot of really great riffs and solos, and it never forgets it's a metal album, and it's very tightly composed from beginning to end, and it's a shining example, I think, of post-metal done correctly. My number 3 album is Paracelsus by Deathspell Omega. This is the 3rd album by the French black metal troupe in their trilogy of albums to do with all sorts of aspects to do with religion and refutation of Christianity on a very literate, studied basis. And to my mind, this is the sort of thing that's extreme metal done right for the modern age. It's unquestionably black metal, and it's very heavy from beginning to end, but it's never cheesy, it's never goes into the sort of bombastic theatrics that a lot of you would associate with black metal, none of the sort of Call of the Winter Moon sort of posing. It's extremely sophisticated, very chaotic sounding music. It's very sinister with lots of overlapping guitar lines and very spectral, I suppose, production. But it's also got this very urgent and very epic sense of class almost. It feels like metal's answer to classical music while still retaining a very great sense of its own identity. That's the word I think for it. The whole album just oozes class from beginning to end, even while being utterly brutal and evil. I love it. Number 2, and I know I swore I would review this album, and I'll just give my thoughts on it in brief here, is Agaloch's Marrow of the Spirit. Agaloch, of course, are one of my favourite bands of all time operating today. And even though this is only their 4th full-length album released in like 11 years, every time they release an album, it's an event for everyone who enjoys this sort of experimental, folksy sort of black metal. There's a lot more of a black metal influence on this album than their last couple of records, but it's still this incredibly evocative series of compositions, soft ambient folksy passages underpinned by John Hamm's sort of half-whispered, half-growled vocals, interspersed with these really Lovely guitar leads go over black metal blast beats, alternating with soaring guitar lines that all sorts of blend together to create some of the most amazing musical climaxes you'll hear this year. And there's so many folk metal and black metal bands out there today using naturalistic imagery to sell their albums, but Agaloch are utterly evocative of those sort of natural landscapes, and they make it sound effortless. There's actually a note in the back of the liner notes for that album saying that all the lyrics were written during John Harm's tour of the Carpathian Mountains, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It sounds like this is the soundtrack to a person wandering alone through the Carpathian Mountains. It's atmospheric as all hell, and it just puts so many other bands in that scene into the shade. But my number one album for 2010, and this was pretty much a foregone conclusion ever since I listened to it for the first time about 6-7 months ago, is of course After by Izan. I was never really interested in the sort of ex-singer-songwriter for Emperor in his project for his first two albums, Adversary and Angel. I listened to a few tracks from those albums when they came out, and you know, they were sort of okay, but never really anything that sort of stood out among the black metal scene. This, on the other hand, grabbed my attention straight away, and it absolutely blew me away when I heard it from beginning to end. This album is pretty much nothing short of a miracle. It reconciles all the sort of everything that's being done right in the sort of experimental black metal renaissance that's going on in the latter half of the last decade, with the sort of conventional riffs and solos of good old-fashioned traditional progressive and heavy metal, and it just sounds absolutely amazing. There's not really anything I can find wrong with it. Songs are absolutely sublimely well composed and progressive and constantly finding new ways to surprise me, and every riff, every solo is just absolutely phenomenally well composed, and everything's in its place. Nothing is self-indulgent, nothing is over the top, while still being absolutely epic and impressive and atmospheric as all hell. And just to top it off, there's the introduction in quite a few of the songs on this album of a free jazz saxophone in sort of the mode of John Coltrane and Miles Davis and those sort of artists, and it just fits so well with everything that's on this, all the other avant-garde elements of this album, that you wonder why more metal bands haven't included a saxophone. It just works so well. Everything in this album just gels together, and it just needs to be heard to be believed, to be honest. This isn't just the album for the year for me, it sets a pretty high fucking bar for the rest of the decade. 2011's got a lot to live up to after that. So yeah, those are my top 5 for 2010. There are a few I'm afraid to say that I didn't get around to that I wanted to. I haven't heard Triptychon's Eperistera Daimonis, I think that's how you pronounce it. I wasn't overwhelmed by the tracks I did hear from that album, but I'm going to get around to that in a while. I'm afraid to say I didn't hear Enslaved, Axioma Ethico Dini either, and there are a few other ones, including Blind Guardians at the Edge of Time, Iron Maiden's Final Frontier, that I didn't hear. But obviously, you know, with limited time and money, there's only so many albums you can hear, and I think, frankly, in the face of everything After did right, I'm not sure anything else in 2010 could top that. So anyway, that's me. Those are my top 5 for 2010. Thrash till death, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.